Number 10. Symbiote Spider-Man. While technically still 616 Peter Parker, Symbiote Spider-Man could be considered an alternate in the sense that it was a very specific version of Peter, or a very specific time in his life where he took to using more brutal and violent tactics to deal with criminals. This was of course brought upon by the alien symbiote who had bonded to Peter and who he had mistaken for just being a new suit initially. Eventually, Spider-Man in his black suit realized that the suit itself was alive and had kind of taken him over. He fought hard, sought out help, and would eventually become separated from the suit, who otherwise did not wish to leave him. In so doing, Spider-Man would unwillingly create an even worse villain in Venom. At least initially. Venom might be a hero now, but of course he did not start out that way, instead being a determined and relentless enemy to Spider-Man in his early years in the comics, who also sometimes was prone to cannibalistic tendencies and threats. Number 9. Superior Spider-Man. Superior Spider-Man is an alternate version of Spider-Man who actually hails from the reality of Earth 616 as well. Superior Spider-Man was the name given to Otto Octavius' version of Spider-Man, which came about after a plot to steal Spider-Man's body was successful. Otto's body was failing, and so he decided to live on by swapping bodies with Peter Parker, which meant that Peter's consciousness ended up dying in Otto's failing body, while Otto's consciousness got to live on inside Peter's young and healthy bod. However, Peter managed to convince Otto to be a hero before he passed away, and so Otto set out to do so, aiming to be a better hero even than Peter had been. Of course, Octavius in the end wasn't really cut out for heroics, although he did do his best. He struggled at times with making the right choices and was also prone to doling out more severe forms of punishment for villains and using more sinister methods when it came to keeping the streets safe. In the end, he chose to relinquish the title and body back to Peter, who still managed to live on via his subconscious, which still remained attached to his original body. And friends, if you are loving this list and you want more lists like it, be sure to let us know by smashing that like button. I mean, there's definitely a lot of evil Spider-Men out there, so I'm pretty sure we could keep going with this one. Number 8. The CEO. In an alternate 2099 reality we see explored in the video game Spider-Man Edge of Time, Peter-Man actually ends up being the big villain. In this reality, Peter goes on to become the CEO of Alchemex. His goal was noble, but kinda selfish and also kinda messed up. He hoped to use time gateway technology to channel quantum energy and bring back the lives of all of those that he'd lost. In this reality, Peter Parker was still Spider-Man, but either faked his death or just let everyone believe he had died so he could work behind the scenes as Alchemex's CEO, getting everything in place so that he could eventually put his own plan into motion. This version of Peter ends up getting erased from time after Miguel O'Hara's Spider-Man beats him up and manages to basically reset young Peter's story, thereby convincing Peter to never become the CEO of Alchemex and preventing this evil future self from ever existing. Number 7. Asset 42. Asset 42 was likely one of the first clones ever made by the Assessor of Miles Morales. This clone was considered to be a burner clone and only lasted a few issues, but what a roller coaster of a ride those few issues he appeared in were. This evil version of Miles Morales first appeared in issue 17 of the Miles Morales Spider-Man series, and shortly thereafter perished in a fight against Miles. Miles seemingly kills Asset 42 in this fight, but in reality the clone was revealed to have only really been made to last for about a day. So it's highly likely that even without fighting Miles, he would have just died, as he was already breaking down and basically turning into liquid-like goo, as is evident in his final fight against the original one and only Miles Morales. Asset 42 was in league with Ultimatum and helped to kidnap the real Miles for that villain. Number 6. Ultimatum. Ultimatum is an evil alternate version of hero and Spider-Man Miles Morales. Or really, he's the main counterpart to Miles, who hails from Earth 1610, the Ultimate Universe. Ultimatum is the version of Miles that existed on Earth 616, his 616 counterpart. 616 Miles was a criminal who allied himself with the Kingpin. Growing up and belonging to a crime family, he proved his loyalty to Wilson Fisk and was permitted by the Kingpin to later on retire, because he was so loyal. However, after his wife died, he decided to do what Kingpin himself had ultimately decided against when it came to his dead wife Vanessa, to find an alternate version of her in the multiverse who was alive so that he could reunite with her. Miles ended up in the reality of Earth 1610 as a result. Eventually, he would return to Earth 616, only to find that Miles of 1610 had emigrated there. Ultimatum at this point decided to set things right and planned to send Miles and his family back to 1610, taking back his rightful place as the Miles Morales of 616, and aiming to become a prominent criminal and villain in New York thereafter. Number 5. Salim. Recently, Miles Morales got his own clone saga in his series Miles Morales Spider-Man. It turned out that the Assessor had made clones of Miles after capturing and studying him. This batch of clones was unstable, and after escaping were on the hunt to find a cure using any means necessary. Salim was sort of like the leader among them, and he ended up at odds with Spider-Man Miles and Spider-Man Peter. Due to being raised while rapidly aging by the Assessor, Salim and his brothers were kinda messed up and kinda misguided and kinda evil. They inherently struck out at Miles and Peter when the two groups of Spider-Men crossed one another's paths. After Miles mistook their found cure for a serum to make more clones and ended up destroying it, Salim decided to kidnap Miles' baby sister, Billy, in order to lure Miles to him. With only a few hours left to live, Salim wanted to face Miles, hoping to prove that he had successfully been created to be the superior version of him, despite being otherwise unstable and defective, as so many clones have been and often are. Number 4. Kraven the Hunter. It's not just Doc Ock who's taking a swing at web-slinging when it comes to Spider-Man's rogues gallery. Kraven also once decided to step into Peter's shoes and become Spider-Man for a short time. This was during Kraven's last hunt, when Kraven seemingly had killed Peter and then took his place to prove that he was the better between the two. Kraven's approach to heroics was even more brutal in my opinion than Otto's, with many villains ending up fatally injured after Kraven attempted to get rid of them. In the end, it was revealed that Spider-Man wasn't actually dead, but had simply been given a drug to put him in a hibernation-like state after Kraven had disposed of him. Eventually, he was able to rise from the grave and return only to find out that Kraven had been making a mess of the Spider-Man mantle by adopting it in his absence. Kraven would end up basically surrendering, content with his last hunt, believing that he'd accomplished everything he had set out to do in his life. This story and Kraven's time as Spider-Man ends with him taking his own life. But don't worry, this is comics, so of course Kraven would be back. Number 3. Pestilence. Pestilence hails from an alternate AOA, Age of Apocalypse reality, the reality of Earth 5701. Here, Spider-Man ends up being chosen to become one of Apocalypse's 4 horsemen of death. He takes on the role of Pestilence, and this much more evil version of the character, allied with mutant supervillain Apocalypse, also really looks the part too. He has fangs which are poisonous and 6 arms, really looking more like a Spider-Man than most of his heroic counterparts typically do. Here, Peter was actually chosen to become one of Apocalypse's 4 horsemen because he was considered so inherently good at heroics and as a person, I imagine. Apocalypse chose heroes he identified as the best among them to become his horsemen in this reality. Number 2. Spider Doppelganger. The Doppelganger, or more specifically, the Spider Doppelganger, or the Spider-Man Doppelganger if you want, was originally an enemy created by the Magus during the Infinity War event. He was one of the many evil doppelgangers created to fight against the superhero community, which opposed Magus in the conflict. Although, like many of the other doppelgangers, the Spider-Man Doppelganger would die during Infinity War. He wouldn't stay dead though, as so many of the other doppels had. Instead, Spider Doppelganger ended up being resurrected by Demogoblin and would end up joining with him for a time, acting as his sidekick and being treated kinda like his pet. Spider Doppelganger would also go on to team up with such villainous spider enemies as Carnage and Shriek. In fact, he'd actually become for a time very close and loyal to Shriek, who treated him as though he were her own son. Number 1. Norman Osborn. On the reality of Earth 44145 lives a version of Norman Osborn who becomes imbued with spider-like powers and abilities. Of course, this being Norman, he decides to use said power in his pursuit of more power, not inherently being the hero type. Peter Parker, who used to work for Norman, reveals his plan to Norman's son and Peter's friend Harry in a letter. This leads to Peter's death, which in turn motivates Harry to fight his father. Norman Osborn as Spider-Man would go on to team up with Superior Spider-Man and Spiders-Man briefly during the Spider-Geddon event, but would end up partnered solely with Spiders-Man after suggesting that to defeat the Inheritors, they simply trap them on Earth 616. Obviously, as that was Superior Spider-Man's homeworld, he was not really down for this plan. Number 10. Man-Spider. Man-Spider is a version of Peter who ended up mutating and having multiple arms from the main continuity. It was a pretty freaky time in Peter's life and happened after Spider-Man tried to create a cure to get rid of his abilities and return him to his normal old depowered self. Unfortunately for Peter, this definitely did not work as planned and instead just left him with 4 arms instead of 2. Basically the opposite of the desired effect, leaving him more freaky than normal, which was kind of what he was going for. There is a version of the 4-armed Spider-Man who actually ended up keeping the arms instead of getting rid of them, and he hails from the reality of Earth 1298 and is known as Man-Spider, obviously. I'm guessing that having a secret identity would be pretty tricky for someone like Man-Spider. Number 9. Savage Spider-Man. Savage Spider-Man had an upbringing among monsters, and for that reason can be considered kinda monstrous. His appearance isn't super monstrous, although he does share his editorial name with a series that seems to feature a pretty frightening looking mainstream Savage Spider-Man, which we may or may not talk about later. Savage Spider-Man of Earth 83043 ended up getting his powers from growing up in the Savage Lands. His story is that he was lost there after the plane he was on with his parents crashed. His parents died in the crash, but young Peter survived and was taken in by the giant spiders of Savage Land, whose toxic bites helped him to build up both an immunity to toxins and also granted him spider-like superpowers. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you haven't already, please head on over to Facebook where you can follow us there as well. It really does help us out here and it helps us out there, so yeah, just help us out. And also, thanks for doing that. If you've already done that. You're like, I get it, Amanda, you say it every time. Just want to make sure you know. Number 8. Scarlet Spider. Kaine was one of the clones of Peter Parker that we got to know in the Clone Saga. He typically goes by the mantle of Scarlet Spider now, which at one point was actually used by another Peter clone, Ben Reilly. Initially in the comics, Kaine was presented more as a villain, or at least a misunderstood villain. He misunderstood hero. He wasn't really completely a straight up villain, but he did some shady things. He was a clone that was basically defective, and as a result his degeneration messed with his mind. He also came with the mark of Cain, which was pretty monstrous, which allowed him to seemingly burn the skin of those he touched, typically leaving his mark of Cain on their face. In reality, this was just a variation of Spider-Man's wall crawl power, as when Spider-Man crawls on walls, this is because of little hook hairs basically in his hands and feet, which allow him to stick. See the Sam Raimi movies for that in person. Similar deal for Cain, but he was using this to basically melt people's faces at the time. Number 7. Ghost Spider. Not to be confused with the other Ghost Spider, Gwen Stacy of Earth 65, this Ghost Spider is an alternate version of Peter Parker from Earth 11638. In this reality, Uncle Ben did not die and was there to help mentor Peter Parker as he continued on his journey as a hero. Peter here became not just a celebrity and an icon as a superhero, but was also a successful business owner and a philanthropist. However, in secret, he and Ben were working together to lure other Spider-Men from other realities to their world so that they could zap them of their power, killing them in the process in order to bolster Earth 11638 Spider-Man, transferring their powers to him and making him stronger. In the end, Spider-Man of Earth 616, who fell into this trap, helped Earth 11638 Peter Parker to see the error of his ways. Having a change of heart, this version of Spider-Man sacrificed himself to save 616 Peter, ending up in a coma as a result. He was returned to life by an alternate Sorcerer Supreme who needed his help, and then came back as the Ghost Spider, who kinda looks like a blue flame Ghost Rider. Number 6. Mainstream Savage Spider-Man. Mainstream Savage Spider-Man comes from his own self-titled series, which spins out of Non-Stop Spider-Man. So if you wanted to read Savage Spider-Man, I'd recommend going back and reading that first. I think it's only like 5 issues, so it's also not too long. This story, I believe, is part of the mainstream continuity, so technically the Peter Parker that we see here in his monstrous form is in fact Earth 616 Peter Parker. In the Non-Stop Spider-Man series, there was even mention of the Beyond Corporation, which also helped me to really cement this, at least in my mind, as part of the main continuity canon. I mean, I saw it was kind of listed as that, but I was skeptical, and then I saw that and I was like, nah, no, it's probably main continuity. I think we can definitely say it's main continuity. So hopefully I am right and not wrong about that. But while this is technically 616, it's also a very specific look and time in Peter's life, like back when he had those 4 arms, which we kind of touched on earlier. So I figured I could count it for the purpose of this list. It's also where our thumbnail for this video will likely come from, so thought it might be cool to explain it if you're like, hey, what's that thing? That's Savage Spider-Man. Savage Spider-Man is Earth 616 Peter Parker mutated by the drug known as A+, which typically improves performance at the cost of intelligence for most users. However, for Spider-Man, due to his unique physiology, it also turned him into a kinda like part man, part spider monster hybrid thing. Poor Peter. Number 5. Spider-Man. Spider-Man is definitely one of the creepiest ideas for an alternate Spider-Man that we've seen in maybe ever. This version of Peter Parker was actually consumed by spiders, but his consciousness was also absorbed by them. So while physically he's gone, mentally he kinda like lives on in them. He's literally a Spider-Man made of spiders. Hence the name Spiders-Man. He has a tragic backstory, but don't feel too bad for him. He also would be the one to team up with a Norman Osborn version of Spider-Man, plotting to betray the rest of the Spider Army that he had been recruited to. And he also, as a bunch of spiders, seems to enjoy kinda eating people, a taste he developed as time went on. Number 4. Patton Parnell. Patton Parnell is one of the vilest alternates of Spider-Man around. He shows up during our exploration of the Spider-Verse, where we learn that he is a fairly sadistic alternative Peter Parker whose hobbies include things like burning ants with a magnifying glass on hot sunny days and spying on his neighbor whom he's kinda obsessed with, Sarah Jane. Patton, of course, is likely twisted in part because it is heavily implied that his uncle mistreats him. He is bitten by a spider, but instead of gaining miraculous abilities that all in all make him a more responsible person and a hero, he becomes a spider-like creature, mutating and becoming more monstrous and murderous, both inside and out. Yikes. Number 3. Poison. Poison is an alternate version of Peter Parker inspired by the Spider-Man story The Other. He hails from a what if where we explore the idea of what would have happened had Spider-Man rejected his connection to the spider within and rejected instead of embracing his role as a spider totem. This would have left Peter vulnerable basically to outside attack. Trapped within his cocoon with no way out, the symbiotic being that we often refer to as Venom sensed Peter's vulnerability and saw a chance to merge with him. Venom then leaves his current host Matt Gargan to forcibly connect with Peter, and together they become Poison. Poison is horrifying and attempts to recruit Mary Jane as his partner, but after she rejects him, he believes that the corpse of Gwen Stacy will suit him better. Oh dear. Number 2. Matt Gargan. Matt Gargan is known as the Spider-Man villain Scorpion, but at one point he too became an alternate version of Spider-Man. Albeit a really messed up and twisted version, as he served as Spider-Man for Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers, which was primarily made up of villains posing as heroic counterparts. In Mac's case, the heroic mantle he was made to fill in for was Spider-Man, although he wasn't so much Spider-Man but kinda like an alternate Venom posing as Spider-Man. His suit was made of the symbiotic being known as Venom, who was merged with him at the time, and was also like really juiced. But Norman fixed it so that he wouldn't appear as juiced. He still kinda got like a little giant. He got a little giant when it came to him attacking people though. This often turned Matt Gargan's Spider-Man into a horrifying monster who threatened to, and often actually did, devour those people who stood in his way, even sometimes almost eating his own teammate, which obviously they did not like. Number 1. I-APEC. I-APEC is known in Marvel Comics as I-APEC the Decapitator, and was once worshipped as a god in Peru. Remember how we talked about Man-Spider earlier? I-APEC is like a more terrifying version of that being. He is typically known as having pointed teeth, snakes for hair with multiple arms, and his lower half being the hairy body and legs of a spider. He ended up getting recruited to Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers to act as their Spider-Man after Matt Gargan was Spider-Man, because this was a different version of Spider-Man, a different version of the Dark Avengers, after Norman Osborn escaped the Wrath the second time, this time successfully, and then attempted to resurrect Hammer and bring back the Dark Avengers. I-APEC was made to look more humanoid, more like Spider-Man with a genetic formula, except for the fact that, you know, he had 4 arms still, so almost like Spider-Man, but not quite. Later on, he would also be coerced into serving on Luke Cage's Dark Avengers, which were kinda like DC's Suicide Squad at the time.
Number 10. Peter Parker. Hey, we didn't say which Spider-Man was doing the embarrassing here. Peter Parker and Miles Morales met for the first time when Peter was teleported to Miles' universe. Now, I don't know why Peter's first decision was to attack Mr. Morales. He's had clones of himself before, and he's also been to other alternate universes, but hey, that's what he did. And it was 110% a mistake. As fans of Miles know, he is extremely capable. And he also has a unique Spider-Man power set. He used his Venom sting to paralyze Peter while jumping over him. He then went invisible and got Peter with a sneak attack kick to the face. It doesn't stop there though. After Peter demasked Miles, he got a nice electric shock that knocked him out cold. For an 11-year-old kid, Miles gave the experienced Peter Parker quite the beating. Number 9. Winter Soldier and Falcon. For a young lad, Peter Parker seems to overpower a lot of people. In his introduction to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Peter just shows us, and 2 of Captain America's best pals, that he ain't someone to mess with. During their fight, he overpowered the super soldier, even using his metal arms against him, disables and webs up Falcon, and redirects a huge chunk of metal flung at him by the Winter Soldier, all while quipping in the best ways possible. It was honestly so awesome to see when it first happened. He leaves them laying on the ground exhausted and webbed up. Not only an embarrassment for the 2 veteran soldiers and heroes, but a really fitting and hilarious introduction for the character to the MCU. Number 8. Luke Cage. A lot of the time, when a new hero is introduced into a comic book world, a fight between the misunderstood hero and another has to take place. That is exactly what happened when Luke Cage came on the scene. Luke Cage, the hero for hire, showed up in the Amazing Spider-Man number 123, hired by J. Jonah Jameson to capture Spider-Man for the death of Norman Osborn. Luke Cage ain't a guy you should underestimate by any means. Super strength and stamina, bulletproof skin, and a healing factor. But it's Spider-Man. Luke tackles Spider-Man off a roof and gets a few punches in. But Spider-Man kicked him off of another roof, teased him about basically being a mercenary, slammed him through a brick wall, got several fists to the face in, used Luke's own weight against him, and punched him through a skylight. They come to blows later on in the comic with pretty much the same outcome, causing Luke Cage to quit this one particular job. Go Web! Fly! Up and away Web! Shazam! Go Web go! 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 Go Web go! Oh wait, that's not my power. No, my power is to make YouTube videos for you guys. Do you know what gives me this power? You liking and subscribing to the channel. And you are doing an absolutely stunning job. Keep it up. And don't forget to check out our Facebook for more content. Number 7, the Hulk. In terms of raw power, Spider-Man stands absolutely no chance against the Hulk. I think his spider sense may give him some kind of advantage, but there is no way he is lasting long in that fight. Unless he gets a power boost in the form of, I don't know, the power cosmic. Oh, that's exactly what happened in the Amazing Spider-Man issue number 328. The Grey Hulk, who yes is a bit weaker and logical compared to his Savage counterpart, is hired by Sebastian Shaw to target Spider-Man. Money's always a good motivator. Unfortunately for Hulk, Spider-Man has been going to the cosmic gym and hitting the cosmic weights. He lands some pretty heavy blows on the Grey Goliath and even blinds him with a new I-beam power. When some kids are put in danger though, Spider-Man ends the conflict quick by punching the Hulk into orbit and then saving him before he suffocates, standing all confident with his hands on his hips and like that. Number 6. The Fantastic Four. In the very first issue of his self-titled magazine, Spider-Man is putting other heroes to shame. Spider-Man infiltrates the Baxter building, where he is encased in a plexiglass cage that he very easily opens the door to. He takes a single punch from the thing before he throws him into Johnny Storm. When Reed tries to catch Peter, he totally just dodges it and webs up Mr. Fantastic's hands. He uses his spider sense to detect Sue Storm while she's invisible and spins her around really fast with her lasso. But then, Johnny Storm gets him in a circle of flame. He says, and I quote, "Well, I'll just jump over that clown's little trap." It's honestly a pretty impressive display, and it happened in no less than 1.5 pages. The fight ends when Spider-Man lets him know that he's here to join up, and with that little fight was just a display of what he can do. Yeah, that little display would probably do better than a resume. Number 5. Iron Man. In the Civil War storyline, we know that Spider-Man initially is on the side of Tony Stark's Iron Man, but after he sees the lengths that Tony is willing to go to, he has a bit of a change of heart. Obviously, this leads to a scuffle between the two. At this time, Tony had given Peter the Iron Spider suit. What he didn't tell Peter is that he built in an emergency override that would shut down the suit and essentially shut down Peter with the simple phrase Omega Omega Epsilon 9. It's only a bit of a jerk move. You took Peter under your wing, but you're going to plant a failsafe against him? It kind of makes you look like you know you're guilty. But then again, he is a genius, he is a member of the Illuminati, and he is not the kind of guy to take risks. But how is this embarrassing for Tony? Well, I'm glad you asked, my little nerds. Peter is no idiot, and behind Stark's back, he hacked into the suit and built in his own override to override the override that Tony put there. Passcode, surprise. And the suit is back up and running and covers Tony's helmet in a thick layer of web, allowing Peter to get in a good punch and escape. Number 4. Wolverine. This one's a pretty quick one. I bet some of you thought I was gonna pull from the Wolverine vs. Spider-Man comic. I'll do you one better. It should be obvious, but you don't dare insult Mary Jane Watson to Peter's face. In Amazing Spider-Man issue 522, Peter is awoken with a call about a newspaper article claiming Mary Jane has a little entanglement with Tony Stark. It's obviously not true and actually a setup by a villain. But that's not the point right now. Peter got out of his bed in Stark Tower and goes looking for his wife. Along the way, he runs into Wolverine in a room with a very lovely high-up view of the city. Now, Logan decides to start going on about how Mary Jane messed up big time, and after a warning from Peter, he decides to comment on her lack of brains. This lovely little comment gets him thrown through an unbreakable glass window, and it gives him a really colorful way to catch a cab. Number 3. Daredevil. When Spider-Man was in possession of the symbiote suit, he wasn't his normal self. He was much more ruthless. And Spider-Man can already knock criminals into a coma when he is pulling his punches. When Spider-Man interrupts Sin Eater Stanley Carter from attacking Betty Brant and almost killing her, he starts to lay into the guy, beating Stanley while giving him an earful. Peter goes so far that Daredevil notices his heartbeat pounding and pulls him off of the beaten villain. He defends the criminal from Peter, who is seemingly gonna kill him. If you want him, you'll have to come through me. Probably not the best choice of words there, Daredevil. The very next panel shows Daredevil flying through a window. If it wasn't such a serious moment, I would laugh. Nah, I did laugh. Is that wrong? I can't help it, I'm sorry. Number 2. The X-Men. It seems that Spider-Man really shows his skill when he comes into contact with teams of heroes. First the Fantastic Four, and in the 4th issue of Secret Wars, the X-Men. As if dealing with multiple superpowered beings was his speciality or something. I think the best part about these altercations is the way he just keeps talking while he's embarrassing them. After Xavier senses Spider-Man listening in on their conversation, Spider-Man attacks the X-Men a little prematurely, I'll admit. He dodges Wolverine, webs Colossus' face, dangles Rogue from a rod, webs up Nightcrawler faster than he can say BAMF, and swats Wolverine away with a single swing and escapes. It's just so crazy to me how he knows that he easily outclasses almost every one of the X-Men. Or if not, he knows exactly how to subdue them. Number 1. Superboy. If we're doing a video about characters embarrassing other heroes, there is almost always going to be one point that has to do with the DC and Marvel crossover event. Just like the first point, this isn't actually Peter Parker though, but it's a clone of him, so that's basically the same thing. When the DC Marvel crossover happened, Ben Reilly had taken up the Spider-Man mantle. And it was him that fought Superboy on a rooftop. To get things going, Spider-Man hits the Superboy with a webbing right to his very stylish sunglasses. Superboy, just trying to get a hit on our spider friend, busts a hole into a water tower, drenching the entire battlefield. Spider-Man wouldn't stand too long in a one-on-one slugging match with this guy, but that's not his specialty anyways. Just as Superboy is about to land a flying blow into Spidey, he jumps out of the way, firing webbing all over the guy and leaving the soaking wet Superboy to fly straight into an electrical box, taking him right out of the fight.